Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to look at history a little differently. Instead of reading through dry textbooks, we're going to view a 150-year American legacy exactly the way a master distiller does by examining liquid artifacts. We're exploring the remarkable story of Old Forester. It's a brand whose timeline is literally poured into glasses, capturing moments of innovation, disaster, and absolute resilience. It's an incredible question, right? Just think about the sheer number of businesses that rise and fall in a single decade. Yet somehow, Old Forester managed to survive rampant industry corruption, literal infernos, and a nationwide constitutional ban on its very product, all without ever ceasing production. The answer to this mystery lies in a story of absolute precision and a totally groundbreaking approach to consumer trust. Okay, let's dive into this. Picture the 1860s and 70s. The whiskey market was completely chaotic. Seriously dangerous, actually. If you wanted whiskey, you'd take a jug down to the tavern to fill it straight from a barrel. But shady retailers would often stretch their supplies by cutting the bourbon with everything from prune juice to literal turpentine. Yikes. Contrast that with the solution presented by George Garvin Brown, who was a young pharmaceutical salesman at the time. He understood that doctors and patients needed a completely reliable product, so he introduced whiskey sold exclusively in a sealed glass bottle. Section 1. A promise in glass. Let's move on and see how this builds across a rapid succession of historical hurdles. In just its first 50 years, the company established the first bottled bourbon in 1870, adapted to the massive Bottled and Bond Act of 1897, navigated a devastating bottling line fire in 1910, and faced the ultimate existential threat, the beginning of Prohibition in 1920. Brown's early advertisements proudly declared Old Forester the only bourbon in a sealed bottle, and this fundamentally shifted how people viewed whiskey. It moved it from a questionable tavern commodity to a highly respected, reliable staple. What we really need to understand here is that this wasn't just some clever packaging or a marketing gimmick. This was a revolutionary act of consumer protection. He was ensuring safety and purity nearly 30 years before the federal government even stepped in with the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897. And to back up that sealed bottle, Brown did something wild. He provided a handwritten guarantee. He batched whiskey from 3 different distilleries just to ensure the flavor profile never wavered, and then he placed his own signature on the label of every single bottle. That personal signature was his word to the doctors and pharmacists prescribing it. It proved this whiskey was uniform, safe, and precisely what they expected. Section 2. Liquid time capsules. Now, what's really interesting is how the modern distillers at Old Forester treat their Whiskey Row series. They don't just see them as different flavor profiles, but as actual physical artifacts. Each expression in this series is meticulously crafted to represent and honor a specific, monumental milestone in the brand's history. And what's truly incredible is the brand's unbroken physical connection to those historical events. Think about their historic home on Louisville's Whiskey Row at 119 West Main Street. They operated out of this very building from 1882 to 1919. And amazingly, they moved right back into it in 2018. The building even survived a massive block fire in 2015, standing firm and supporting the structural integrity of the entire street. It's amazing how history literally dictates the liquid. Take the 1870 original batch. It sits at 90 proof to recreate Brown's very first sealed recipe. Then the 1897 expression bumps up to 100 proof to honor the Bottled and Bond Act. The 1910 bottle sits at 93 proof, capturing the sweet smoky result of a distillery fire. And finally, the 1920 Prohibition style jumps to a really robust 115 proof, mirroring the bold profile of medicinal whiskey aging in the barrel during America's dry era. Let's look a little closer at that 1910 bottling line fire, because it actually resulted in a pretty magnificent happy accident. So, step 1, a fire breaks out, completely halting the bottling line. Step 2, the workers are suddenly left with a massive vat of mature whiskey that literally has nowhere to go. Step 3, to save the liquid from total ruin, they immediately pump it into a second set of new charred oak barrels. And without even realizing it, they had just invented the first double-barreled bourbon. Today's 1910 Old Fine Whiskey expression is the literal taste of that historical accident. Because the bourbon is exposed to a second heavily charred barrel, it develops this thick, creamy mouthfeel. When you taste the pronounced notes of burnt caramel, smoked wood, and sweet cherry, you are quite literally experiencing the sensory echo of the 1910 fire. But as fascinating as that fire was, an even bigger inferno was coming for the entire industry. Section 3. Surviving American Prohibition. This era would become the ultimate test of the Old Forester legacy. Looking back at the archives from a distiller's perspective, the numbers are just terrifying. 70%. That is how much Kentucky bourbon production plummeted within just 2 years of the 18th Amendment taking effect in 1920. The price of oak barrels absolutely crashed. 2/3 of the distillery workforce lost their jobs. An entire American industry was effectively erased overnight. To put that massive 70% drop into perspective for a second, consider this. The year before Prohibition, Kentucky alone produced nearly 200 million proof gallons of bourbon. 200 million. Suddenly, thousands of distilleries went dark. Iconic brands vanished, were sold off for parts, or were forced completely underground into the black market. So the crucial point here is, why did Old Forester survive when almost everyone else went under? Well, they were granted Permit P3, making them one of only 6 Kentucky distilleries legally allowed to produce medicinal whiskey. And this wasn't just luck. It was the direct result of the pharmaceutical trust George Garvin Brown had established way back in 1870. The federal government looked at their 50-year paper trail of sealed bottles, safety, and meticulous ledgers and deemed them inherently trustworthy. But surviving meant adapting to an incredibly unnatural, heavily regulated environment. Just imagine being a master distiller constrained by these rigorous mandates. The government dictated every single drop be exactly 100 proof, sold only in 1-pint bottles, and completely restricted to a doctor's prescription. They faced relentless quarterly IRS inspections, and to keep the supply flowing, they had to buy up orphan casks from shuttered rivals and meticulously blend them. Plus, that 100-proof mandate meant the whiskey of the 1920s was significantly hotter, bolder, and way less forgiving. Because of all that meticulous compliance, Old Forester holds a truly monumental distinction. It is the only bourbon continuously sold by the exact same company before, during, and after Prohibition. When the 21st Amendment finally passed, they didn't have to rebuild from scratch. They simply flipped 1,800 existing pharmacy accounts straight into wholesale retail distributors practically overnight, utterly dominating the post-Prohibition market. Section 4. Modern Unicorns and Innovations. That deep, unbroken legacy of survival didn't just preserve the past, it paved the way for the future. Today's distillers look at those survival years as the foundation for the brand's most coveted modern experiments. First released in 2002 to honor George Garvin Brown's birthday, the Birthday Bourbon is actually recognized as the first vintage-dated bourbon in American history. And the 2025 release is incredibly special. It marks the 25th anniversary of the series, featuring a 12-year-old vintage distilled on the single day, April 5, 2013. It is so highly sought after that it's released via a national sweepstakes for $200 a bottle, strictly at the distillery itself. And this brilliantly illustrates the brand's willingness to innovate even their most prized expressions. For this 25th anniversary birthday bourbon, they completely shifted production to a sweet mash. Unlike a traditional sour mash, they used absolutely no acidic backset from prior distillations. Relying purely on yeast gave the distillers immense creative control, yielding a uniquely soft, silky profile bursting with honeycomb, vanilla, and tropical fruits. That same spirit of innovation also drives the 117 series. Introduced in 2021 by master taster Jackie Zycon, this series is really all about pushing boundaries. It gives the masters total creative freedom to experiment way outside the brand's standard flavor profiles. With small batch distillery exclusive releases dropping just a few times a year, like the intensely concentrated High Angel share, it keeps this 150-year-old brand on the absolute cutting edge. So to wrap up this explainer, from the very first sealed glass bottle back in 1870, all the way to the experimental 2025 Sweet Mash, Old Forester's history isn't just a list of dates in some dusty textbook. It is a living, liquid archive. These expressions are literal time capsules of adversity, unyielding quality, and an unbroken craft. Which leaves us with this final thought. Every time a master distiller creates a new batch, they're laying down a marker for the next generation. As you sip on a bourbon backed by an unbroken 150-year history of survival and innovation, it really makes you wonder, what incredible future legacy is sitting in the dark of Warehouse K being barreled today? Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the archives. Keep learning, keep exploring, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.